Cuba is struggling through one of the worst economic crises in its history. For years now, one problem after another has hit the country, and things are now reaching a state of total crisis. The country is suffering from food and fuel shortages. Rolling blackouts lasting as long as 10 hours are keeping people in the dark, and businesses shut down. Inflation is out of control, running at over 40%. The country's coffers are empty, and it's struggling to borrow money from abroad. And its biggest source of foreign money, its tourism industry, is recovering only very slowly from the COVID pandemic. Cuba's problems have grown so big that people are fleeing the island in record numbers. In 2022, more than 300,000 people fled Cuba for the United States, the largest wave of out-migration in the country's history. How did Cuba get here? And what's next for this communist Caribbean island that has been at odds with the US for 60-plus years? In this video, we'll run down how Cuba turned into an economic hot mess and what is likely to happen next. But first, be sure to subscribe to our channel for the latest economic insights, and if you like this video, hit the like button to help us get the word out. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean and also the most populous, with 11 million people. Located 100 miles south of Florida, Cuba was part of the Spanish Empire in the 19th century, and in those days it was one of the highest income countries in Latin America. Its main export was sugar, a commodity that remains a major part of its economy to this day. When the U.S. won the Spanish-American War in 1898, Cuba, along with Puerto Rico and many other territories, came under direct U.S. control. The U.S. military occupied the island on and off until 1934, but even after that time, Cuba remained essentially under U.S. control. With the U.S. as its new major trading partner, Cuba's economy boomed. But the boom was very uneven. Some Cubans found decent work in Havana's tourism industry, catering to wealthy Americans in nightclubs and casinos. But in the countryside, it was a different story. Large American companies came to dominate sugarcane farming. Formerly independent sugarcane farmers now had to work for peanuts at giant sugarcane plantations. The Cubans weren't happy about it, but they had little choice. The country was run by a military dictator named Fulgencio Batista, who did America's bidding. In the 1950s, socialism became increasingly popular in Cuba. Batista repressed the socialist movement, killing as many as 20,000 Cubans in the effort. Then, in 1959, the guerrilla forces of Fidel Castro took control of the country. Castro began nationalizing American-owned businesses and real estate. In 1962, the Kennedy administration slapped sanctions on Cuba, cutting it off from the giant U.S. economy. Those sanctions remain in place to this day. For help keeping pro-American forces at bay, Castro turned to the Soviet Union, which gladly gave Cuba aid. A neighbor of the U.S. rejecting capitalism and turning towards communism was a major win for the USSR. For the next 25 years, the Soviet Union was Cuba's major benefactor. The Soviets sent free oil and food to the island. They built Cuban infrastructure, including the power plants that Cuba uses to this day. This was the essence of Castro's deal with the devil. Instead of gaining independence, Cuba became dependent on the Russians. The country traded one foreign master for another. But by the 1980s, the Soviet economy was slowly falling apart. The Russians could no longer afford to send generous aid to Cuba, and the island's economy began to suffer. Castro's government had borrowed billions of dollars from numerous countries, and in 1986, Cuba defaulted on its debt. The legacy of that debt default continues to this day. When a country defaults on its debts, it's not the same as when a business or a household goes bankrupt. If a person or business can't afford to pay their debts, they can declare bankruptcy, and a court will resolve their financial issues. The same doesn't exist for governments. When a government goes bust, it has to come to an agreement with all of its lenders, and if it doesn't, it can cause serious problems in its international relations. For Cuba, solving these issues took decades. It wasn't until 2015 that Cuba reached an agreement with the Paris Club, a group of 13 countries that had lent the country money prior to its default. Today, Cuba has signed agreements covering 85% of the debt it defaulted on in 1986, but that still leaves 15% of the debt unresolved. As recently as this year, Cuba was in court fighting efforts by lenders to get that money back. In one case, brought before a court in England, a vulture fund called CRF1 had bought the debt that Cuba owed to two European banks. Vulture funds are a nasty business. They're hedge funds that buy debt that has been defaulted on for a tiny fraction of the amount owed, and then they go after the borrower to get payment on that debt. Because they pay so little for the rights to the debt, they can make an enormous amount of money collecting on it. In the case of CRF1, it bought the debt Cuba owed to French bank Credit Lyonnais and Italian bank Istituto Banco Italiano for 10 cents on the dollar. If it could collect just 20 cents on the dollar from Cuba, it would make a huge profit. The original debt borrowed in the early 1980s was worth the equivalent of 15.8 million US dollars, but because of 40 years of unpaid interest, by 2023, the total owed by Cuba on those debts was around $80 million. Fortunately for Cuba, and unfortunately for the backers of the Vulture Fund, in April of this year, the English court threw out the case. Cuba had argued that CRF1 didn't have the right to buy the debt from the European banks, and the court agreed. The original debt agreement stated that the Cuban government had to approve any transfer of ownership of the debt. CRF1 argued that they had approval. Their documents were signed by a representative of Cuba's government named Don Stevenson. But Don Stevenson is now sitting in a Cuban jail, convicted on bribery and corruption charges. The English judge ruled that the debt transfer to the Vulture Fund was illegitimate. This marks a significant victory for Cuba. It takes pressure off the country because it means other private lenders likely won't sell their Cuban debt to Vulture funds that will go after the money in courts. But it doesn't solve the other massive problems that have been plaguing the Cuban economy since the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the USSR fell apart in 1991, Cuba's economy went into a deep crisis. The government, still under Castro's rule, realized things would have to change. Among its reforms was opening the country to foreign tourists. Although the U.S. maintained an embargo on Cuba since the 1960s, most other wealthy Western nations didn't join that embargo. This is why Cuba was able to borrow money from French and Italian banks, and it's why it was able to open a lucrative tourist industry. By the mid-1990s, tourists from Europe and Canada were flocking to Cuba's tropical beaches, and large resort hotels were opening in Varadero on the island's north coast. This brought an influx of foreign money to Cuba, and the country established a dual economy. One economy was in Cuban pesos, and the other in US dollars brought in by foreigners. Dollars could only be exchanged for what was known as the convertible peso, a currency pegged to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. But only the US dollar, or convertible peso, could be used to buy imported goods. The regular Cuban peso could only be used to buy local goods, and it was illegal for Cuban citizens to use the convertible peso or dollars. The idea was for Cuba to benefit from the foreign flow of currency while keeping its own local economy protected from foreign influence. Cuba's economy fractured into two, and all businesses and institutions had to be on one side or the other of the divide. This created new divides in Cuban society. Cubans began calling this system tourist apartheid, or dollar apartheid. A large underground economy based on the US dollar sprang up around the country, and those with access to US dollars, and who were willing to use them illegally, were able to get richer. This supposedly communist country began to see serious levels of wealth inequality. The island nation found a new friend in Venezuela, which replaced the old Soviet Union as a supplier to Cuba. But in 2016, Venezuela entered a major economic crisis and pulled back on aid to Cuba. That same year, Donald Trump was elected president of the U.S., and the following year, he began toughening sanctions on Cuba. Cuban people, which depend on imports for 2/3 of the food they consume, began to suffer. Things hit a boiling point in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and supply chains were interrupted. On top of that, Cuba's major cash cow, tourism, came to a halt. Without the constant flow of foreign money from tourists, Cuba ran short on money to import food and medicine. Stores ran dry, and long lineups for food formed. The government called on Cubans to start growing their own food wherever they could, even in cities on balcony apartments. Otherwise, they would be facing starvation. In 2020, Cuba's economy shrank by 11%, large enough to meet the definition of an economic depression. Trump's loss of the election to Joe Biden in 2020 didn't help. The new Biden administration continued with the tougher sanctions against Cuba brought in under Trump. The Cuban people began to reach their breaking point. In the summer of 2021, the country saw its largest protest since Castro took power in 1959, triggered by food and medicine shortages. The government responded with a crackdown. Police moved in and initiated mass arrests. More than 700 people were charged with crimes, including sedition. But the government of President Miguel Diaz-Canel, Castro's successor, could see the writing on the wall. It moved to liberalize the economy, removing some import restrictions and allowing Cubans to convert the Cuban peso for US dollars, at least for a limited time. But even as those moves took some of the pressure off, new problems began to present themselves in the post-pandemic era. Beginning in 2021, like in many other countries, Cuba began to see rising inflation. However, in Cuba, inflation got seriously out of control, reaching nearly 80% in late 2021. By the spring of 2023, it had cooled down a little, but was still running above 40%. Rising global oil prices became a serious problem for the country. Those power plants built by the Soviets are oil-fired, and when oil prices started rising, Cuba couldn't afford to keep the power plants supplied. The situation came to a head in August 2022 when an explosion hit a fuel depot near the country's largest thermoelectric power plant. One person was killed and as many as 125 were injured. The plant was forced offline. Cuba initiated rolling blackouts that would last as long as 10 hours in any given location. People had to abandon their electric stoves and begin cooking using wood and charcoal. In the cities, restaurants and beauty salons operated by candlelight or flashlights. People began sleeping and socializing outside at night because of the lack of air conditioning. As the economic crisis unfolded, more and more Cubans decided to leave the country however they could, and they aimed for the same place Cuban migrants have been going to for decades, the United States. Today, the typical path for an American-bound Cuban is to go to Nicaragua, which doesn't have visa requirements for Cuban visitors. Then the migrants make their way in caravans from Nicaragua to Mexico and cross the land border from Mexico into the U.S. But the old way to America, crossing by water to Florida, has also soared in the past few years. It's estimated that in 2022, 313,000 Cuban migrants entered the U.S. Not only is this creating a humanitarian crisis in the U.S., it's also creating an economic crisis in Cuba. Most of the people who leave Cuba are highly educated and of working age. With these people fleeing, many businesses are unable to find employees and are being forced to shut down. University professors say their classrooms are emptying. The country is facing a massive brain drain. President Diaz-Canel addressed the issue last October, blaming it on U.S. policies and saying that every departure is a defeat for Cuba. But to stop it from happening, Cuba will have to fix its massive economic problems. Amidst soaring inflation, unaffordable energy prices, and a constant stream of the country's best and brightest leaving, what can it do? It looks like, once again, Cuba will lean on foreign powers to rescue itself from crisis, and this time, an old friend is coming to the rescue: Russia. When President Vladimir Putin launched his military assault on Ukraine in 2022, the U.S. and other NATO powers slapped harsh sanctions on Russia. Now Russia appears to be building a coalition of nations sanctioned by America, and Cuba is part of its efforts. In the 6 months after the Ukraine war began, Russia shipped $350 million worth of oil to Cuba, the biggest inflow of Russian oil to the country this century, and enough to cover 40% of Cuba's oil needs. In February of this year, Russia donated 25,000 tons of wheat to Cuba. That came just a few months after Cuba's President Diaz-Canel visited Moscow, where Putin unveiled a new statue to Fidel Castro. At the ceremony, Putin praised Castro as an example of a world leader who managed a country under sanctions from the United States. But with Russia suffering from its own problems under the weight of sanctions and a global oil embargo, there's only so much it can do to help Cuba with its problems. Nor can Cuba afford to alienate the West by getting too close to Russia. It still depends on tourist dollars from Canada and European countries that are NATO members. So in the words of Cuba expert William Leo Grande, the country is stuck between a rock and a hard place. However things play out, we can be sure of one thing: it will be a long time before Cuba pulls itself out of the mess it's in today. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of our other content by clicking on one of these videos. Be sure to hit the like button, because that helps us spread the word about our channel. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about our latest videos. Thanks for watching.